Picture this. A heavy boot kicks dirt into your eyes. You try to scream, but a gag of rough wool chokes the sound in your throat. You're bound hand and foot, lying at the bottom of a 6-foot pit dug into the English mud. Above you, the silhouette of your commander blocks out the sun. He gives a sharp nod. 2 men step forward, dragging a limp body between them. It's the corpse of the man you stabbed last night in a drunken rage. Your messmate, your shield brother. They don't hang you. They don't behead you. That would be too merciful for a traitor to the Brotherhood. They heave the dead weight over the edge. The corpse lands on your chest with a wet thud, knocking the wind out of you. You stare into the glassy, dead eyes of your victim, inches from your own face. Then the shovels start working. The soil rains down, covering the body. Covering you. Darkness swallows the light. You're being buried alive with the evidence of your crime. This is the Lex Castrensis, the law of the camp. This is the brutal internal code of the Housecarls. To the history books, they are the elite bodyguards of the Anglo-Saxon kings. To their enemies, they are the deadliest axemen in Europe. But to each other, they are members of a warrior cult where loyalty is the only currency, and death is the only exit strategy. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. History often paints medieval soldiers as patriotic heroes defending their homeland. Forget that image. The Housecarls were created for one reason: a hostile takeover. In 1016, King Cnut of Denmark conquered England. He was a Viking sitting on a foreign throne, surrounded by angry English nobles who wanted him dead. He couldn't trust the local militia, the Fyrd, to protect him while he slept. So he imported a solution. Cnut brought in roughly 3,000 professional killers from Scandinavia. These weren't part-time soldiers who went back to harvest wheat in the autumn. They were a standing army, the first of its kind in Britain since Rome fell. They lived in the King's Hall, they sharpened their axes while the rest of the country ploughed the fields, and most importantly, they were paid in cash. This payment changed everything. The Housecarls received the Danegeld, a massive tax extorted from the English population. Imagine the resentment. You're an English peasant starving through the winter, and you watch a squad of towering Danes walk into your village. They're well fed, their arms adorned with heavy gold rings, their chainmail gleaming with oil. They're here to take your last silver penny to pay for their own wages. They were the king's enforcers, his tax collectors, his executioners. They operated like a private military corporation. They had their own jurisdiction, separate from English law. If a housecarl killed a civilian, he answered only to the king and his own assembly. This legal immunity made them terrifying. They walked the streets of London and York like apex predators. A housecarl didn't need to shout to clear a path. The sight of the distinct long-handled Dane Axe resting on his shoulder was enough to make a crowd part like the Red Sea. Their loyalty was bought, yes, but it was also forged in iron. The king gave them gold, equipment and status. In return, they gave him their lives. This wasn't a metaphor. The oath of a housecarl was absolute. In an age where changing sides was common political manoeuvring, these men were anomalies. They didn't switch allegiances when the tide turned. They stood their ground. By the time King Edward the Confessor took the throne, and later Harold Godwinson, the Housecarls had evolved. They absorbed Englishmen into their ranks, becoming less of a Viking occupation force and more of a national elite guard. But the core philosophy remained the same. The king is the ring giver, we are the shield. This professional detachment made them the most dangerous unit on the battlefield. A peasant levy would break and run if they saw their neighbours dying. A housecarl would simply close the gap in the shield wall. They trained to fight as a single organism. They knew that if the man to their left fell, the wall weakened. So they fought harder. They were engineered for the grim mechanics of slaughter. But in 1066, this machine was about to be tested against 2 other military superpowers. The Housecarls were the finest heavy infantry in the world, unshakable and terrifying. Yet, they were walking into a year that would demand more than just skill. It would demand their extinction. They were about to face a storm from the north and a hammer from the south, and the gold rings on their arms would soon weigh as heavy as shackles. War has always been expensive, but in 11th century England the price was calculated in silver pennies and human misery. To understand why the Housecarls were so feared, you have to look past their axes and look at their paychecks. Before their arrival, armies were temporary things. When a king needed to fight, he called upon the Fyrd. These were farmers, millers, and blacksmiths dragged from their homes, handed a spear and told to stand in a line. They fought because they had to. They fought until the harvest came due. And then they deserted in droves because starving in a field was no better than dying in one. King Cnut changed the math. He didn't want farmers. He wanted professionals. But professionals don't work for patriotism. They work for profit. The Housecarls were the first standing army in English history to be paid a regular competitive wage in coin. This was revolutionary. It was also ruinously expensive. To fund this elite force of roughly 3,000 men, the crown levied the Heergeld, an army tax that bled the country dry. Imagine the dynamic in a local tavern. A group of Housecarls walks in. They are loud, foreign, and rich. They throw silver around like it's water. In the corner, a local English veteran of the Fyrd watches them. He fought in the same wars, maybe even on the same shield wall, but he went home to a broken plough and a debt he couldn't pay. The Housecarl went home to a warm hall and a bag of silver collected from that veteran's own taxes. The resentment was palpable. It was a class war disguised as military service. This economic divide created a different breed of soldier. For a Housecarl, war was not an interruption of life. It was life. They treated battle with the cold detachment of a butcher approaching a carcass. While the Fyrd relied on adrenaline and desperate courage, the Housecarls relied on muscle memory and superior equipment. Let's look at the gear. A typical Fyrd man might wear a leather jerkin, perhaps a helmet if his grandfather left him one, and carry a round wooden shield that would splinter under a heavy blow. A Housecarl was a walking tank. He wore a knee-length coat of chainmail called a hauberk. This wasn't just metal rings, it was an investment equal to the value of a small farm. Underneath, he wore padded wool to absorb the kinetic energy of a strike. On his head sat a conical helmet hammered from a single sheet of iron, often featuring a nasal guard that obscured his humanity, turning his face into a mask of steel. But equipment is useless without the will to use it. The Housecarls brought a level of discipline that was alien to the Anglo-Saxon way of war. In the chaos of a medieval melee, the natural instinct is self-preservation. When the arrows start falling, men bunch together. When the cavalry charges, lines break. The Housecarls were drilled to suppress these instincts. They operated as a single organism. If the order was to hold, they stood like statues while arrows rattled off their shields. If the order was to advance, they moved in a synchronized step that terrified disorganized enemies. This discipline made them the perfect tool for internal suppression. When a town in the north refused to pay the tax, the king didn't send the sheriff. He sent the Housecarls. In 1041, 2 of Harthacnut's Housecarls were murdered by a mob in Worcester while trying to collect taxes. The retribution was swift and total. The king sent the rest of the Brotherhood to burn the city to the ground. They hunted the citizens for 5 days. This wasn't a battle. It was a punitive expedition carried out by men who felt no kinship with the people they were slaughtering. By the time Harold Godwinson became Earl of Wessex and later king, he understood that this weapon needed to be wielded carefully. He began to anglicise the force, bringing in more native Englishmen, blurring the line between the foreign mercenary and the National Guard. The Housecarls became the core of his power, the steel tip of the English spear. They were the men who would stand in the front rank, taking the hardest blows so the terrified farmers behind them wouldn't have to. So, when we talk about the Housecarls, we aren't just talking about bodyguards. We're talking about a social caste separated from the rest of society by violence and wealth. They were the merchants of death, selling their skills to the highest bidder, which happened to be the crown. And as 1066 approached, the crown was about to get its money's worth. The investment of decades, the silver, the training, the best steel in Europe, was about to be put to the ultimate test. The merchants were about to open shop and business would be booming. If you stood on a battlefield in 1066, the most terrifying sound you could hear wasn't the scream of a dying horse or the roar of a charging army. It was a low, rhythmic whistling, the sound of 5 feet of seasoned ash wood slicing through the air at 80 miles per hour. This was the calling card of the Dane Axe. While the sword was a status symbol and the spear was a tool for the masses, the great axe was a masterpiece of specialised engineering designed for one specific purpose: the systematic dismantling of the human body and everything protecting it. Most people imagine a medieval axe as a heavy, clumsy block of iron. Yeah, something closer to a wood splitter's tool. The reality of the Dane Axe was far more sophisticated. The blade was surprisingly thin, often no thicker than a few millimetres at its widest point, tapering down to a razor-edged crescent of hardened steel. This lightness was intentional. A heavy head would be slow, and in a high-stakes duel, slowness is a death sentence. By keeping the head light and the haft long, the Housecarls created a weapon with terrifying velocity. Think of the physics involved. The long ash handle acted as a massive lever. When a Housecarl swung the axe in a wide overhead arc, the tip of the blade travelled a much greater distance than his hands, accelerating exponentially as it moved. By the time that crescent of steel reached its target, it carried enough kinetic energy to shear through a wooden shield like it was wet parchment. It didn't just dent helmets, it cleaved them. There are accounts from the era describing Housecarls decapitating fully armoured horses with a single blow. This wasn't exaggeration. It was a testament to the brutal efficiency of centrifugal force applied to a sharp edge. But this power came at a suicidal cost. To wield a Dane axe effectively, you had to use both hands. This meant the Housecarl had to do the unthinkable. He had to abandon his shield. In an age where the shield was your only life insurance against a rain of arrows or a sudden spear thrust, the axemen chose to stand naked to the world. They traded total defence for absolute offence. This created a unique tactical niche on the battlefield. The Housecarls wouldn't just stand in the open, they operated within the shield wall, protected by the men to their left and right who carried heavy lindenwood shields. The axeman would wait for the enemy to crash against the wall. Then, at the perfect moment, he would step forward or strike from behind the first rank. He would reach over the top of the shields, his 5-foot reach allowing him to strike targets that thought they were safe. The psychological impact of this weapon was perhaps its greatest strength. Imagine being a young Norman knight or a Norwegian raider, crouched behind your own shield, feeling secure in your chainmail and iron. Suddenly, a giant of a man steps out from the English line. He isn't stabbing at you with a spear, he's winding up a blow that looks like it could split the earth. You raise your shield instinctively, but you know, deep down, that the wood won't hold. You see the axe descend, and for a split second the world goes silent. The Dane axe was also a versatile tool of execution. The beard or the lower hook of the blade could be used to snag the rim of an enemy's shield, pulling it down to expose their throat for a comrade's spear. It could be used to trip horses or hook a rider out of his saddle. Every inch of the weapon was lethal. Even the butt of the wooden haft was used to crush windpipes or shatter teeth in the tight, suffocating crush of the melee. However, the weapon demanded a lifetime of training to master. A Housecarl had to understand his kill zone, the exact radius where his axe was most effective. Too close, and the long haft became a liability. Too far, and he would overextend, leaving his ribs wide open to a counterstab. They practiced these swings until their shoulders were thick with muscle and their hands were calloused like stone. They learned to flow with the axe, using the momentum of a missed strike to pivot into a second blow, keeping the heavy blade in constant deadly motion. By the middle of the 11th century, the Dane axe had become the signature of the English elite. It was more than a weapon, it was a statement of intent. It told the enemy that the men carrying them were not interested in survival. They were interested in the total destruction of anything in their path. As the political tensions of 1066 reached a boiling point, these widowmakers were being polished and honed. The physics of war were about to meet the reality of politics, and the resulting collision would be written in the splinters of thousands of shields. Imagine walking into the Great Hall of Westminster on a winter evening in the mid-1060s. The air is thick with the scent of roasting meat, wood smoke, and the sharp, fermented tang of honeymead. This isn't just a dining room, it is the beating heart of the English state. At the centre of the hall, the king sits on his high throne, but the space around him belongs to the Brotherhood. These men don't go home to wives or farms at the end of the day. They sleep here, on the very benches where they eat, their great axes leaning against the timber pillars within arm's reach. This domestic intimacy created a psychological bond that transformed a group of mercenaries into a single, lethal entity. The life of a housecarl was governed by a strict hierarchy that mirrored the layout of the hall itself. Your social standing was literally measured by how close you sat to the king. The most veteran warriors, the ones who had bled in a dozen skirmishes, occupied the high benches. The newcomers, the grooms or juniors, sat near the doors, exposed to the draughts and the watchful eyes of their superiors. Moving up that bench was the only ambition that mattered. You didn't gain rank through family names or land ownership, you gained it through the gift and counter-gift economy. The king was known as the Beargiver, the ring giver. This wasn't a poetic metaphor, it was a job description. Every year at midwinter, the king would distribute heavy gold and silver arm rings to his housecarls. When you accepted that ring, you weren't just taking a paycheck, you were accepting a shackle of honour. The ring was a physical weight on your arm that reminded you of the debt you owed. If the king gave you a sword, you owed him his enemies' heads. If he gave you a cloak, you owed him your body to keep him warm in the shield wall. This was a cycle of escalating debt that could only be balanced by one thing: dying for the man who fed you. This brotherhood was held together by the Witherlogh, a set of 60 meticulously detailed rules that governed every waking second of their lives. These weren't just military regulations, they were a survival manual for men living in constant high-tension proximity. The rules covered everything from the order of seating to the handling of disputes. If two housecarls argued, they weren't allowed to draw steel. If they had to bring the dispute before the Housecarls, the assembly of the Brotherhood, here, your peers would judge you. If you were found to be a liar or a coward, you were nithing, a social leper. You were stripped of your rings and expelled. In a world where your only identity was the Brotherhood, being cast out was a fate often described as worse than death. This isolation from the rest of English society was intentional. The housecarls were an elite other. They spoke a language that was increasingly a mix of Old Norse and Old English, a dialect of the barracks that separated them from the peasants in the fields. They developed their own dark humour, their own songs, and their own brand of fatalism. They knew that the English people viewed them as the king's tax wolves, and they leaned into that reputation. The more the public feared them, the tighter they clung to each other. They became a military cult, where the only true reality existed within the circle of the shield wall. This psychological conditioning produced a terrifying brand of loyalty. In most medieval battles, when a king or a general fell, the army dissolved. The contract was seen as broken. The man paying the wages was dead, so the service ended. The housecarls operated on a different logic. To them, the death of their king was the ultimate gift. It was the moment they could finally pay back every ring, every meal, and every gallon of mead they had ever consumed. Their code dictated that if their lord fell, they had to stay on the field until they either avenged him or joined him in the earth. To survive a battle where your king died was the ultimate shame. It was a stain that no amount of silver could wash away. We see this manifested in their daily rituals. They practiced the feud. If one member of the Brotherhood was insulted by an outsider, the entire 3,000-man force was insulted. This made them a logistical nightmare for the king to manage in peacetime, but a perfect weapon in war. They were a loaded crossbow, constantly under tension, waiting for the trigger to be pulled. They lived in a state of ordered violence, where their aggression was suppressed by the Witherlogh inside the hall, only to be unleashed with surgical precision on the battlefield. As the decade turned and the shadows of 1066 grew longer, this brotherhood was at its peak. They were wealthy, they were disciplined, and they were utterly obsessed with their own legend. They saw themselves as the last practitioners of an ancient, heroic way of life, the heirs to the sagas. They didn't know that the world of the mead hall was about to collide with the world of the feudal castle. They didn't know that their gold rings were about to be traded for iron grave markers. But as they sat in the firelight, sharpening their axes and passing the mead horn, they wouldn't have cared. They had their code, they had their king, and they had each other. For a housecarl, that was more than enough to face the end of the world. January 1066 began with a funeral and ended with a crisis. King Edward the Confessor was dead, leaving behind an empty throne and a kingdom surrounded by predators. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful man in England and the leader of the Housecarls, he seized the crown immediately. He knew the peace of the mead hall was over. For months he kept his elite guard on high alert along the southern coast, staring across the English Channel, waiting for the Normans to appear. But the first strike didn't come from the south. It came from the north, carried on the frigid winds of the Norwegian Sea. In September, news reached London that sent a shockwave through the royal court. Harald Hardrada, the legendary King of Norway, a giant of a man who had fought from the gates of Constantinople to the frozen fjords of the north, had landed near York with 300 ships. He wasn't alone. Tostig Godwinson, King Harold's own brother, was at his side, fueled by a thirst for vengeance. The northern defences had crumbled. York was on the verge of surrender. Harold Godwinson faced a choice that would define his legacy. He could stay in the south to protect London from the looming Norman threat, or he could gamble everything on a desperate strike to the north. He chose the gamble. He turned to his housecarls. These men had spent months in the summer heat, armoured and ready, and now they were asked to perform a feat that defied the biological limits of the 11th century. The distance from London to York is roughly 185 miles. In an age where most people never travelled more than 10 miles from their birthplace, this was an odyssey. For a medieval army, a standard day's march was perhaps 12 to 15 miles. Harold needed to do it in 4. Imagine the sound of 3,000 professional soldiers beginning that march. It wasn't the heroic fanfare of a parade. It was the rhythmic, a metallic clatter of thousands of chainmail hauberks rubbing against leather and wool, a sound like 1,000,000 coins being shaken in a bag. They marched along the old Roman roads, the straight, flint-hard arteries of Britain known as Ermine Street. Every step was a calculation of pain. A housecarl's equipment, his mail, his helmet, his shield, and his heavy Dane Axe weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. They didn't stop for the night in the traditional sense. They moved in a state of active exhaustion. They ate while they walked, gnawing on hard bread and dried meat. They slept in short, brutal bursts by the side of the road, only to be kicked awake by their captains 2 hours later. The dust of the Roman road filled their lungs and turned their sweat into a thick grey paste that chafed their skin raw under their armour. This is where the years of professional training and superior nutrition paid off. A peasant levy would have collapsed by the second day, their feet blistered and their spirits broken. The housecarls were built differently. Their bodies were engines fueled by years of high-protein diets and constant physical labour. They possessed a level of cardiovascular endurance that was unheard of among the general population. They pushed through the wall of fatigue, their minds locked onto the cadence of the march. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were a force of nature moving at 25 miles per day. By the time they neared the River Derwent just outside York, they were ghosts of men. Their eyes were bloodshot, their faces sunken from dehydration, and their feet were likely bleeding inside their leather boots. But they didn't slow down. Harold knew that his only advantage was surprise. Hardrada and Tostian believed the English king was still hundreds of miles away in the south. The Vikings had already taken hostages from York and were relaxing at a place called Stamford Bridge, basking in the glow of what they thought was an easy conquest. They had even left their heavy armour behind on their ships, bringing only their weapons and their arrogance to the riverbank. On the morning of September 25th, the Vikings looked toward the horizon and saw a cloud of dust. Then they saw the glint of sunlight hitting steel. One of the Norse sagas describes the sight. It was like looking at a ridge of broken ice. The housecarls had arrived. They hadn't just marched, they had sprinted across a kingdom to catch the greatest warrior in Europe off guard. Though the sheer impossibility of this march is often overshadowed by the battles that followed, but it remains one of the greatest logistical achievements in military history. It was a testament to the iron will of the Brotherhood. They had pushed their bodies to the point of collapse, driven by a code that demanded they be wherever their king needed them to be. As they crested the final hill and looked down at the unsuspecting Viking camp, the fatigue seemed to vanish. The Housecarls gripped their axes, adjusted their shields, and prepared to transform their exhaustion into a refined professional slaughter. The impossible sprint was over. The massacre at the bridge was about to begin. The sun of September 25th, 1066 did not rise on a battlefield, it rose on a slaughterhouse. As the English Housecarls crested the final ridge overlooking the River Derwent, they saw the Viking camp spread out in a state of terminal relaxation. Hundreds of Norsemen were lounging by the water, their heavy mail hauberks left miles away at Rickle with their ships. They were dressed in linen tunics, their weapons leaned against trees, believing the English king was still a week's march away. The surprise was so absolute that for a moment, the only sound was the wind and the distant lowing of stolen cattle. Then the English line began to move. The Housecarls didn't charge with a wild, disorganized scream. They advanced in a terrifying rhythmic silence. Every step they took brought them closer to men who were essentially their cousins. This is the detail history often glosses over. The men in Harold's army and the men in Hardrada's fleet spoke languages that were mutually intelligible. They shared the same stories of Odin and Thor, the same ancestral roots in the cold north. But as the first English arrows began to fall, that kinship evaporated, replaced by the mechanical necessity of the kill. The Vikings scrambled for their weapons, but the momentum was entirely with the English. The Norsemen on the western bank of the river were cut down where they stood. The water turned a dark, bruised purple as bodies tumbled into the current. But as the English reached the narrow wooden structure of Stamford Bridge itself, the momentum stopped. Legend tells of a single Viking giant, a berserker, who stepped onto the bridge. He stood alone against an entire army. For a long hour, this nameless warrior became a human dam. Every Englishman who stepped onto those narrow planks met the business end of a Dane Axe. He reportedly killed 40 men, his blade rising and falling with the tireless precision of a thresher. But the English Housecarls weren't interested in fair play or heroic duels. They were professionals. While their comrades kept the giant occupied at the front, one soldier found an old swill tub, crawled into the freezing water of the river, and floated beneath the bridge. Through a gap in the wooden planks, he thrust a long spear upward, piercing the Viking's groin where his mail would have been. The giant fell. The dam broke. The English poured across the bridge like a flood. What followed was not a battle of manoeuvres, it was a 3-hour grind of industrialised butchery. The Housecarls reached the main Viking line on the eastern bank. Hardrada, the thunderbolt of the north, died early, a stray arrow catching him in the throat. Without their king and without their armour, the Vikings should have broken. Instead, they fought with the suicidal ferocity of men who knew there was no way home. The Housecarls of Harold Godwinson went to work. This was the moment their years of training with the Great Axe reached its zenith. They didn't just fight, they disassembled the enemy. We have skeletal remains from this era that show the terrifying power of these blows. Skulls split from crown to jaw, femurs sheared through in a single strike, arm bones severed while still raised in a futile attempt at defence. The sound was a horrific cacophony of steel hitting bone, a wet crunching noise that stayed with the survivors for the rest of their lives. But as the sun began to set over the blood-soaked fields, a strange hollow atmosphere descended on the English victors. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a crushing psychological weight. These Housecarls were walking among the corpses, and they heard the wounded calling out for their mothers in a tongue almost identical to their own. They were looting the bodies of men who wore the same style of armourings, who had the same tattoos, and who shared the same Norse blood. This wasn't a triumph, it was a fratricide. The Housecarls had just annihilated the very culture they had originated from. They had proved they were the superior version of the Viking warrior, but the cost was their own sense of identity. Many of these men had cousins or old trading partners in Hardrada's fleet. Now they were stepping over their mangled remains. This was the first taste of the trauma that would haunt the Brotherhood, a realization that they were no longer part of the Viking world, yet not fully accepted by the English one they protected. The victory was total. Out of 300 Viking ships that arrived, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. Harold Godwinson had done the impossible. He had crushed the greatest threat from the north. But there was no time for healing, no time to process the horror of what they had just done. As the Housecarls sat among the dead, wiping the gore from their axes with clumps of dry grass, a lone rider appeared on the southern horizon. He was covered in the dust of a frantic gallop. He brought news that turned the victory at the bridge into a death sentence. While Harold was killing Vikings in the north, William of Normandy had landed his fleet at Pevensey in the south. The Housecarls looked at their bloodied hands and their exhausted limbs. They had just marched 185 miles and fought a battle that would have broken any other army in history. Now the king was calling them again. They stood up, shouldered their axes and prepared to turn around and do it all over again. The butchery at the bridge was over, but the road to the Hill of Death had just begun. The march back to the south was a slow-motion catastrophe for the human body. If the sprint to York was fueled by adrenaline and the hope of a quick victory, the trek to London was powered by nothing but grim, mechanical spite. The Housecarls were no longer the gleaming golden warriors who had left Westminster weeks earlier. Their chainmail was caked with dried Norse blood and northern mud. Their boots were falling apart, the leather soles worn thin by nearly 400 miles of Roman flint. Many of them carried fresh wounds from Stamford Bridge, shallow cuts that were beginning to fester in the damp autumn air. Harold Godwinson didn't allow them time to mourn or heal. He pushed them back down Ermine Street, gathering what remained of the local militias as they went. By the time they reached the capital, the men were walking ghosts, yet they stayed only long enough to sharpen their axes and grab whatever rations the city could spare. William the Conqueror was already burning the countryside of Sussex, systematically baiting Harold into a fight before the English could fully recover. On the night of October 13th, the English army finally reached the ridge of Senlac Hill, a narrow tongue of land blocked by a dense forest. Below them, in the valley, the campfires of the Norman army flickered like a sea of predatory eyes. The contrast between the two camps that night was a study in the transition of warfare. In the Norman camp, the air was filled with the chanting of monks and the clatter of professional armourers. William's knights were being confessed, their sins washed away in preparation for a holy crusade sanctioned by the Pope himself. They were fresh, well-fed, and supported by a sophisticated logistical machine that had been crossing the Channel for weeks. The English camp was a different world. There was no singing and very little prayer. The Housecarls sat in tight circles, huddled for warmth. They drank ale not to celebrate, but to numb the throbbing aches in their joints and the psychological trauma of the slaughter they had just left behind in the north. They were outnumbered, and they knew it. The Fyrd, the farmers and villagers who made up the bulk of the army were terrified, clutching their wooden shields and staring into the darkness. But the Housecarls were the anchor. They moved among the nervous levies, their presence a silent promise of stability. They were the iron core around which the fragile English hope would be built. Harold Godwinson stood at the centre of his guard beneath the fighting man banner. He was a commander who had done everything right and was still facing total annihilation. He chose his ground with the precision of a veteran. The ridge was narrow, barely 800 yards across, forcing the Normans to attack uphill through thick brush and marshy ground. It was a position that favoured the heavy infantryman, the man who could stand his ground and let the enemy break themselves against him. As the first grey light of October 14th began to bleed over the horizon, the Housecarls performed their final ritual. They tightened the straps on their helmets, adjusted the heavy wool tunics beneath their mail, and took their places at the very front of the line. They didn't form a loose formation. They locked their shields together, rim to rim, boss to boss. This was the shield wall. To an observer from the valley below, it looked like a wall of polished scales, a prehistoric beast made of oak and iron sleeping on the hilltop. The Housecarls knew the odds. They knew that William had brought something England wasn't prepared for. Thousands of heavy cavalry and disciplined archers. They were about to fight a modern European army with tactics that had remained largely unchanged since the days of the Great Heathen Army. But as they gripped the handles of their Dane axes, the exhaustion of the march seemed to crystallise into a cold, hard resolve. They weren't fighting for a future they believed in. They were fighting for the man standing behind them and the brother standing beside them. The night of waiting was over. The sun was rising on the end of Anglo-Saxon England, and the Housecarls were the only ones standing in its way. At 9 o'clock on the morning of October 14th, a single trumpet blast from the Norman lines shattered the silence of the Sussex countryside. For the Housecarls standing atop Senlac Hill, this was the moment the years of training, the gold rings, and the brutal discipline of the Witherlogh were meant to justify themselves. They stood in the front rank, an iron-rimmed horizon of linden wood and hardened steel. Behind them, thousands of poorly armed peasants gripped their spears with white-knuckled intensity, their eyes fixed on the terrifying sight of the Norman war machine beginning its ascent. William the Conqueror opened the battle with his archers. Thousands of arrows hissed through the air, arching upward toward the English ridge. In most medieval battles, this opening barrage would have thinned the ranks and sowed panic. But against a disciplined wall of Housecarls, the arrows were an expensive failure. The men in the front rank didn't flinch. They simply tilted their shields upward, creating a temporary roof of wood and leather that caught the shafts like a forest of needles. Because the English were positioned on higher ground, the Norman archers had to fire uphill. Most of their arrows either bounced harmlessly off the overlapping shields or sailed uselessly over the heads of the army to thud into the dirt behind them. When the archery failed to break the line, William sent in his heavy infantry, followed by the pride of his army, the mounted knights. This was the moment of maximum psychological pressure. The Housecarls watched as hundreds of powerful destrier warhorses carrying men clad in full chainmail thundered toward them. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. The air filled with the smell of horse sweat and the deafening roar of Dex Woo, the Norman battle cry. Most infantry in the 11th century would have broken before the horses even reached them. The instinct to run from a charging half-ton of muscle and iron is a biological imperative. But the Housecarls were trained to suppress biology. They leaned into their shields, planting their back feet firmly into the soft English earth. As the first wave of knights crashed into the wall, the sound was like a shipwreck. The shield wall held. The horses recoiled from the wall of spears and the terrifying presence of the Dane Axe. This was where the Widowmakers earned their reputation. While the peasants in the back ranks poked desperately with spears, the Housecarls stepped into the gaps. They didn't stab, they swung. A single overhead blow from a Dane axe could shear through a horse's neck or cleave a knight's leg through his mail and into the saddle. The Normans, who prided themselves on their superior mobility and cavalry tactics, found themselves bogged down in a vertical slaughterhouse. As the hours ground on, the ridge became a slippery mess of blood, mud, and entrails. The Housecarls began a rhythmic chant that rose above the screaming and the clatter of steel. Ut, 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 out, out, out! It wasn't a cry of desperation. It was a professional demand for the invaders to leave their land. It acted as a metronome for the killing, a way to keep the wall synchronized. Every time a Housecarl in the front rank grew too tired to hold his shield, he would signal, and a brother from the second rank would seamlessly slide into his place. Siam, it was a rotating system of violence that kept the wall fresh, while the Normans grew increasingly frantic. By midday, the Norman army was on the verge of collapse. A rumour swept through their ranks that Duke William had been killed. Panicked, the Norman left flank, mostly Breton mercenaries, broke and fled down the hill toward the marshes. Seeing their enemies retreating, the undisciplined English peasants on the right side of the ridge broke formation. They ignored Harold's orders and chased the Bretons down the slope, hungry for easy kills and loot. The Housecarls watched in silent horror. They knew the geometry of the battlefield. By leaving the ridge, the peasants had created a hole in the shield wall. William, who was very much alive, saw the opening. He rallied his knights and turned them back toward the disorganized English pursuers. In the open ground at the bottom of the hill, the peasants were no match for cavalry. They were ridden down and butchered in minutes. This was the turning point. William realised that if he couldn't break the shield wall with force, he would break it with trickery. For the rest of the afternoon, the Normans practised feigned retreats. They would charge the hill, fight briefly, and then pretend to flee in terror. Time and again, despite the shouted warnings of the Housecarls, groups of English peasants would break the line to give chase, only to be cut down in the valley. The shield wall, once a solid and impenetrable barrier, was being thinned out, one foolish pursuit at a time. The Housecarls were forced to stretch their line thinner and thinner to cover the gaps. Their shoulders were screaming with fatigue. Their axes were notched and dull from hitting bone. Their gold rings were slick with the gore of 6 hours of continuous combat. They were still standing, still lethal, but the iron core of England was being eroded. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the Housecarls realised that they were no longer fighting to win a battle. They were fighting to survive a catastrophe. The wall was crumbling, and the knights were starting to find the cracks. By late afternoon, the ridge at Senlac Hill smelled of iron and sweat. The English line, once a solid bar of steel and oak, had become a jagged, bleeding thing. Gaps appeared everywhere as the peasant levies continued to break formation, lured into the valley by the siren song of a retreating enemy. Duke William, recognising that the daylight was fading, ordered his final, most desperate gambit. He commanded his archers to aim their arrows high into the air, causing them to fall vertically, like a lethal rain behind the English shields. At the centre of the chaos stood the Fighting Man banner, a glittering standard of gold and jewels that marked the position of King Harold. Surrounding him were the last of his personal guard, a tight circle of the Housecarls who had survived the sprint to York, the butchery at Stamford Bridge, and now 8 hours of continuous combat at Hastings. These men were the elite of the elite, their chainmail torn and their axes notched. Now yet they remained the only stable element in a collapsing world. Then, the moment that ended Anglo-Saxon England arrived. Whether it was a lucky arrow from the sky that pierced Harold's eye or a targeted strike by a squad of Norman knights, the result was the same. The king went down. The death of a medieval monarch usually signalled the immediate end of a battle. For the feared, the farmers who fought for their homes, the contract was over. Seeing the king's standard fall, thousands of them turned and fled into the dark sanctuary of the Andredsweald forest. They ran to survive, to return to their wives and their ploughs, but for the Housecarls the logic was reversed. Their contract didn't end with the king's death. It reached its final, most binding clause. To survive the king was the ultimate disgrace. To go home while your ring-giver lay cold on the hillside was a social death far worse than any Norman blade. The Housecarls tightened their circle around the mangled body of Harold. They didn't seek a way out. They didn't ask for quarter. They stepped over the king's remains, their boots slipping in the gore of his entrails, and prepared for a final professional suicide. The Normans closed in like wolves. A group of 4 knights, including Eustace of Boulogne, reached the king's body. They didn't just kill him, they disassembled him. One knight pierced his breast with a lance, another struck off his head with a sword, a third disemboweled him, and a fourth hacked off his leg at the thigh. The Housecarls watched this desecration and responded with a ferocity that stunned the victors. They used their heavy Dane axes to clear a charnel house around the corpse, swinging with the mechanical rhythm of men who had already accepted their own extinction. This was the last stand of the English military elite. They fought until the sun dipped below the horizon, and the only light came from the flickering fires of the Norman camp. Every one of them died where they stood. There are no records of Housecarls being taken prisoner at Hastings. There are no accounts of them begging for mercy. They were found the next morning in a perfect circle of death around their king, their silver arm rings still glinting through the mud and blood. The slaughter didn't end on the hill. As the last organised resistance crumbled, a small group of surviving Housecarls and English nobles staged a final vengeful ambush in the darkness. At a place later known as the Malfosse, or the Evil Ditch, they turned on their Norman pursuers. In the treacherous terrain of a steep-sided ravine, the English infantry used the cover of night to drag knights from their saddles and butcher them in the muck. It was a final bloody exclamation point to a day of horrors, a reminder that even in death, the Housecarls were the most dangerous men in Britain. When the sun rose on October 15th, the world had changed. The Golden Brotherhood was gone. The men who had enforced the king's peace and collected the king's taxes were now just meat for the crows. The culture of the Mead Hall, the law of the Witherlogh, and the supremacy of the Great Axe had been buried under a mountain of Norman iron. William was the conqueror, but he had inherited a kingdom of ghosts. The Housecarls had fulfilled their oath. They had stood their ground until the ground was all that remained of them. But as we will see, their story didn't entirely end in the Sussex mud. For the few who weren't on the ridge that day, the ones who had been left behind with wounds or sent on errands, a new, strange chapter was about to begin. They were a people without a country, and they were about to take their axes on a journey across the known world to find a new master worthy of their blades. The dust of 1066 settled on a graveyard. In the years following the Battle of Hastings, England became a landscape of scars. The Norman victors didn't just seize the land. They systematically dismantled the culture that had sustained the Housecarls for half a century. The great halls were burned or converted into stone fortresses. The English language was pushed into the dirt, replaced by the sharp nasal vowels of French. For the few Housecarls who hadn't died on the ridge, the choice was simple: submit to the men who had butchered their king, or find a new horizon where their axes still held value. In the late 1070s, a massive fleet of 235 ships slipped out of the English harbours. It wasn't an invasion, it was an exodus. This was the great migration of the English elite, a diaspora of warriors who refused to bow to William the Conqueror. They sailed through the Mediterranean, past the wreckage of old empires, until they reached the Golden Horn of Constantinople. To the Norse and the English, this was Miklagard, the great city. The Byzantine emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, was a man under siege. His empire was being nibbled away by Seljuk Turks from the east, and Norman adventurers from the west. When a fleet of battle-hardened Anglo-Saxons appeared at his gates, he didn't see refugees, he saw the ultimate insurance policy. He offered them a deal that echoed the old oaths of King Cnut: gold, status, and a place in his personal bodyguard, the Varangian Guard. For the Housecarls, Constantinople was a dream of what England could have been. It was a world of marble, silk, and limitless silver. They were given the keys to the chalk gate and tasked with guarding the emperor's very person. They traded their mud-stained English wool for imperial Byzantine purple, but they kept their Dane axes. To the citizens of Constantinople, they were the axe-bearing barbarians from Thule, a terrifyingly loyal contingent of giants who stood like statues in the Hagia Sophia. The ghosts of Hastings finally found their vengeance in 1081 at the Battle of Dyrrhachium. History has a strange way of repeating its grudges. On the shores of the Adriatic Sea, the English Varangians found themselves facing a familiar enemy, a Norman army led by Robert Guiscard, a man cut from the same cloth as William the Conqueror. The Housecarls didn't wait for orders. When they saw the Norman banners, the trauma of 1066 boiled over into a primal rage. They charged out of the Byzantine line, their axes swinging with a fury that nearly broke the Norman centre. Though the battle ultimately went against the Empire, the English had made their point. They proved that the shield wall hadn't been a fluke. It was a weapon that could still terrify the most advanced cavalry of the age. They became so vital to the Byzantine state that for the next 3 centuries the Varangian Guard would be dominated not by Vikings, but by the sons and grandsons of the men who had lost at Hastings. They spoke English in the heart of Greece, drinking ale and singing songs of a lost home they would never see again. The story takes an even more surreal turn in the wild lands of the Black Sea. Imperial records suggest that Alexios granted a group of these English exiles a territory in the Crimea, which they renamed Nova Anglia, New England. They founded towns with names that sounded like echoes of a forgotten world: Londina, Susako, and York. For a few generations, a small piece of Anglo-Saxon culture survived on the edge of the known world, a bizarre colony of axemen living among the nomads of the steppe. Eventually the Housecarls faded from history, not through defeat, but through assimilation. They became Byzantine lords, Crimean landowners, and Mediterranean merchants. The silver rings they once wore were melted down or buried in foreign soil. but their legacy lived on in the very fabric of the nations they left behind and the ones they helped build. They were the last of the Golden Brotherhood, a class of men who defined themselves by a loyalty that outlived their country. As we look back at the Ridge of Hastings or the bridge at Stamford, it's easy to see the Housecarls as a tragic end to an era, but they were also a beginning. They were the prototype of the professional soldier, the men who proved that war is a craft of discipline, not just a burst of courage. They died for a king who was already a corpse, not because they were foolish, but because their word was the only thing they truly owned. In a world that often feels fractured and transactional, there is something haunting about the Housecarls. They represent the ultimate what-if of history. What if they hadn't marched those 400 miles? What if the arrow had missed? We will never know. What we do know is that they stood until the end, their axes whistling in the Sussex wind, leaving behind a story of iron and oath that refused to be silenced by the passing of 1,000 years. If you followed this journey from the muddy pits of the Witherlogh to the marble halls of Byzantium, I want to hear your thoughts. Was the loyalty of the Housecarls a noble virtue, or was it a suicidal obsession that destroyed the very kingdom they were meant to save? Does the idea of duty unto death still have a place in our modern world, or is it a relic of a more brutal age? Let's discuss it in the comments below. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the lost world of England's deadliest bodyguards. If you want to explore more hidden chapters of history, check out our next video on the screen. Until next time, keep looking for the truth beneath the armour.